Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at a set of presidential actions.
Oh, wow.
They were issued on January 20th, 2025. And let me tell you, these aren't your typical kind of minor policy changes or adjustments.
Right.
We're talking about potential seismic shifts here.
Yeah.
And the focus really seems to be on three main things. One is economic relief. Two is this whole idea of holding the government accountable.
Hmm.
And three is even shaking up how and where we work.
Yeah.
It's like someone just kind of hit the reset button on everything.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really striking how different this is from the previous administration. It's almost like they took the previous agenda and just said, nope, we're doing the opposite.
Yeah, so let's kind of break this down piece by piece. And I think a good place to start would be with what seems to be the cornerstone of their economic plan.
Okay.
And that's this thing called the Delivering Emergency Price Relief for American Families and Defeating the Cost of Living Crisis Memorandum. I mean, the title alone tells you they're not messing around, right? They're definitely coming in strong. And one of the main things they're saying is that the previous administration's policies are the direct cause of this whole inflation crisis.
Oh, wow.
They're specifically pointing the finger at things like excessive government spending and what they call a crushing regulatory burden.
Hmm.
It's almost like they're saying, too much government got us into this mess and less government is going to get us out.
Okay, I'm all for simplifying things, but is it really that simple, though? Can we just slash regulations and expect prices to, magically drop? Doesn't that kind of raise some concerns about things like consumer safety and environmental protection?
That's a really good point. It's definitely a delicate balancing act.
Right.
This memo claims that all the regulations under the previous administration actually added almost $50,000 in costs per household,
Whoa.
which is a pretty staggering number when you think about it.
Yeah.
But then they contrast that by saying that they actually reduced regulatory costs by about $11,000 per household during their first term. So they're very clearly painting this picture of them versus us when it comes to economic policy.
Okay, so let's see for a second that they're right and that overregulation is a big part of the problem. How does this memo actually propose to bring down costs for families?
Yeah.
I mean, what are they targeting specifically?
Well, they're really focusing on areas that directly hit people's wallets. The big ones are housing, healthcare, and energy.
Okay.
So, for example, they want to increase the availability of affordable housing, which, could mean relaxing zoning regulations or maybe streamlining the building permit process.
Right.
They also want to try to simplify healthcare billing, which could potentially reduce all that paperwork and those administrative costs.
Yeah.
And then on the energy front, they're talking about getting rid of roadblocks to domestic energy production,
Yeah.
which they say will lower prices at the pump.
So it sounds like they're trying to tackle this cost of living crisis from a bunch of different angles.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the question is, are these just vague promises, or is there actually a concrete plan to make these things happen?
Well, the memo actually mandates that every executive department and agency has to report to the president every 30 days on their progress in implementing this plan.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like they're trying to build in some accountability and urgency to these efforts.
Okay.
Now, whether it's actually enough to move the needle on these complex issues, that remains to be seen.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to another really big piece of this whole puzzle.
Okay.
And that's this ending the weaponization of the federal government executive order.
Yeah.
This one seems to be a lot about accountability, but it also feels like it's taking some pretty direct shots at the previous administration.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This order doesn't mince words at all. It straight up accuses the previous administration of using law enforcement and intelligence agencies to go after their political rivals.
Really?
And they even give some specific examples to back up this claim, which are honestly pretty concerning if they're true.
Okay, what? Give us the highlights. What kind of accusations are we talking about here?
Well, they claim that parents who were just voicing concerns at school board meetings were unfairly targeted, for example, and that individuals who were just expressing different opinions online got investigated. And there's even a case where someone who shared a political meme on social media was actually thrown in jail.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So if these accusations are actually true, it raises some really serious questions about abuse of power and whether free speech rights are being eroded.
Right, okay. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Couldn't some of these actions be justified? Maybe for national security reasons or to, prevent the spread of misinformation?
That's a really important point because it's always a balancing act between security and individual liberties.
Right.
But this order seems to be arguing that the previous administration crossed a line. They're saying they use these powerful agencies to silence people who disagreed with them instead of addressing legitimate threats.
Okay.
So the order actually mandates a full investigation into these incidents, and it calls for remedies to prevent this kind of thing from happening again in the future.
So it sounds like it's not just about pointing fingers. They're actually trying to put some safeguards in place.
Exactly. They want to change the system. So these agencies are used to protect people, not to target political opponents. And this actually ties back to the economic relief efforts in an interesting way, because they seem to be arguing that a less powerful, less intrusive government will ultimately benefit everyone, both in terms of individual liberty and economic freedom.
So it's all connected. Less government, more freedom, lower costs. That seems to be like the overarching theme here.
Yes, they're trying to present this very unified vision, even if the methods are a little controversial.
Okay.
Now, to really understand the full scope of what they're trying to do, we need to look at a few more orders. Each one targets a different part of the government.
All right, so hit us with the next one. What else is in this stack of presidential shakeups?
Well, next up, we have the hiring freeze memo.
Okay.
And this one basically slams the brakes on hiring any new federal civilian employees. And they're not just talking about a temporary pause. They're actually planning to make the federal workforce smaller through attrition. So that means when people retire or leave their jobs, those positions won't automatically be filled.
Wow, that's a pretty big change. It sounds like they're really serious about shrinking the government. But I can't help but wonder, won't that affect the quality and the efficiency of government services if there are fewer people to actually do the work?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern, and it's definitely something that critics of this plan are bringing up.
Right.
Of course, the memo does say that there will be exceptions for really critical areas,
Okay.
like national security, public safety, and benefit programs.
Okay.
But it'll be interesting to see how they try to balance the need for a leaner government with the need to still maintain essential services for people.
Okay, so they're freezing hiring, aiming for a smaller workforce. What's next on their hit list?
All right, next we have the regulatory freeze pending review executive order.
Okay.
And this one essentially hits the pause button on all new regulations. But they're not just stopping new rules. They're also requiring a review of all existing regulations
Oh, wow.
to see if they actually align with the goals of this administration. It's like they're putting this giant magnifying glass on the entire regulatory landscape.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. A regulatory freeze.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of this is about just stopping everything that the previous administration did.
Well, there's definitely an element of that, but it's also about them asserting control and setting a new direction.
Right.
You know, it's like they're saying, we need to take a step back, assess the situation, and make sure that everything we're doing actually aligns with our vision for the country.
Okay, I get that. But what about the potential downsides? Won't this create a lot of uncertainty for businesses and maybe even delay important regulations that are meant to protect consumers and the environment?
Yeah, those are all valid concerns.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that we'll need to watch closely as all of these actions get implemented. You know, the big question is, how long will this freeze actually last? And will it be a thorough and objective review process, or will it just be used to get rid of regulations that don't fit their ideology?
Right. Okay, let's move on to the final order in this batch.
Yep.
And that's the Restoring Freedom of Speech and Ending Federal Censorship Executive Order. This one seems like it's a direct follow-up to those accusations we were talking about earlier about the previous administration targeting people who disagreed with them.
Yes, this order definitely builds on that whole theme of government accountability. It very clearly states that the government should not be in the business of censoring speech.
Okay.
And it calls for an investigation into any past actions that might have violated First Amendment rights. It's a pretty strong statement in support of free speech, and it's clearly trying to draw a contrast with what the previous administration was doing.
Yeah, it sounds like they're really trying to position themselves as the defenders of free speech, which is a pretty powerful message at a time when a lot of people feel like their voices aren't being heard or they're being silenced. But how will this actually work in practice? What specific steps will they take to actually prevent government censorship?
That's a great question. And honestly, the details are still a little vague.
Okay.
But the order mentions developing guidelines for all government agencies to make sure that they're not overstepping their boundaries when it comes to free speech.
Okay.
And it also talks about giving individuals more power to take legal action if they feel like their rights have been violated.
Got it.
So it's not just about words. It seems like they're actually laying the groundwork for some real changes in how the government deals with free speech issues.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
A bold plan to fight inflation, Serious accusations about the government overstepping its bounds, a hiring freeze, a regulatory freeze, and a strong stance on free speech.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in, and honestly, it feels like we're just scratching the surface of what these changes could really mean.
You're absolutely right.
Right.
And we haven't even talked about what might be the most controversial change of all.
Ah.
And that's the mandate that all federal employees have to come back to the office full-time.
Oh, wow.
That's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat now. We're definitely going to need a whole other episode just to unpack that one. But for now, let's take a break and let all this information sink in. We'll be back in part 2 to dig deeper into what the consequences of all these actions might be and what they could mean for the future. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. So now that we've kind of laid out all the key players in this presidential power play,
Right.
let's try to connect the dots and see what kind of picture emerges.
You know, it's fascinating how all of these actions are so intertwined. Like on the surface, we've got economic relief, government accountability, free speech, and then this return to the office mandate.
Right.
But underneath it all, it feels like there's a much deeper story unfolding.
Yeah.
You know, something about the role of government and the balance of power, and maybe even like a fundamental shift in how we define work and life in the 21st century.
Absolutely. It's like they're trying to rewrite the whole social contract.
Wow.
That unspoken agreement between the government and its citizens.
Okay, so let's zoom in on some of those potential consequences. And I think a good place to start would be with the economic relief efforts.
Okay.
Now, obviously, lowering costs is a good thing, especially for families who are struggling to make ends meet. But I can't help but wonder if this laser focus on deregulation could end up backfiring.
Yeah.
Are we sacrificing long-term stability and safety just for some short-term gains?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's like walking a tightrope.
Right.
On the one hand, too many regulations can stifle innovation and economic growth.
Okay.
But on the other hand, without the right safeguards, we risk things like unsafe products, environmental damage, or even financial instability.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Think of it like building a house.
Okay.
You need regulations to make sure it's safe and structurally sound. But if you have too many rules, it just makes the whole construction process way too burdensome and expensive.
Okay, that's a helpful analogy. So how do we find that sweet spot? How do we balance promoting economic growth with protecting the things that really matter?
It's a constant tug of war, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
It takes careful analysis, open debate, and a willingness to adapt as we learn from our mistakes. What I'm worried about is the potential for unintended consequences. If we deregulate too quickly or too broadly, we could see a rise in unsafe products or environmental damage or even another financial crisis.
Right. Like what happened back in 2008?
Exactly. A lot of people say that was partly caused by deregulation in the financial industry.
Right. So it's not just about getting rid of regulations for the sake of getting rid of regulations. It's about being smart and strategic and understanding how everything is connected.
Exactly. And it's really important for people to stay informed and engaged.
Yeah.
Participate in the debate and hold policymakers accountable for the decisions they're making.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the elephant in the room. Those serious accusations of government overreach. Now, I believe in due process and innocent until proven guilty. But even just the allegations themselves are deeply troubling.
Yeah.
If they're true, it paints a really disturbing picture of a government that's lost sight of its purpose.
Right.
To serve and protect its citizens, not to target and silence them.
It's a reminder that power, even in a democracy, can be abused.
Yeah.
And it's especially unsettling because these accusations are being made against the very institutions that are supposed to uphold the law.
Right.
Imagine if the police were used to silence critics of the government instead of preventing crime.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah, it's a pretty chilling thought.
So what happens next? How do we make sure that these investigations are actually thorough and impartial and not just a political witch hunt?
That's the key.
Yeah.
We need transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
And a genuine commitment to finding the truth, no matter where it leads.
Right.
If these accusations are true, there need to be consequences. But if they turn out to be false, then that needs to be acknowledged too. The worst thing would be for these investigations to just be swept under the rug or used for political gain.
Right. It needs to be about justice and restoring trust in our institutions.
Absolutely. And this actually connects back to the Restoring Freedom of Speech order we talked about earlier. If people feel like they can't speak their minds, if they're afraid of being targeted for expressing different views, then we've lost something fundamental to our democracy.
Okay, let's move on to what might be the most tangible change for a lot of people, and that's the return to in-person work memorandum.
Right.
This feels like a really major cultural shift, especially after so many people embraced remote work during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So what are the potential consequences, both good and bad, of forcing everyone back to the office?
This is where things get really interesting because it affects so many aspects of our lives. How we work, where we live, our social interactions, even our sense of community.
Yeah.
On the positive scene, some people argue that being in the office leads to more collaboration and creativity
Right.
and a stronger team spirit. And then there's the economic impact. Think about all the businesses in downtown areas that have been struggling because people haven't been going to the office.
Right, I read about that. Some cities have seen a huge drop in foot traffic and revenue.
Exactly.
Oh,
So bringing people back to the office could revitalize those areas and help boost local economies.
okay.
But on the other hand, there are concerns about work-life balance and flexibility
Right.
and the environmental impact of everyone commuting again.
Ah.
A lot of people have found that working from home allows them to spend more time with their families and avoid those long commutes.
Yeah, and it can save money too.
Exactly.
Right.
Less office space, lower utility bills, reduce commuting costs.
Yeah.
Those are real benefits.
So it's not a simple issue. There are valid arguments on both sides.
Right. It's about finding a way to balance the needs of employers and employees
Hmm.
and creating a work environment that's productive but also sustainable.
So maybe it's not about going back to the way things were before the pandemic, but about finding a new kind of hybrid model that combines the best of both worlds.
Exactly. It's about flexibility and adaptability.
Right.
And recognizing that there's no one solution that's going to work for everyone.
Okay, so we've explored some of the potential consequences of these actions, from the economic ripple effects to concerns about government overreach to this changing nature of work.
Mm,
It seems like we're at a crossroads, a moment of big change and a lot of uncertainty.
yeah.
So what does all of this mean for the future?
That's the big question.
Yeah,
And honestly, I don't think anyone has a crystal ball.
right.
But what we can do is stay informed, engage in thoughtful debate, and hold our leaders accountable for the choices they make.
Yeah.
These actions could reshape the relationship between the government and its citizens in some really fundamental ways.
Well said, and it's a conversation that we need to keep having. Now let's take a quick break and then come back for our final thoughts on this episode of The Deep Dive. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. It feels like we've been sprinting through this political obstacle course, dodging economic landmines, tiptoeing across free speech tightropes. It's been a lot.
It has been a lot to process.
Yeah.
But hey, that's what we're here for, right?
Exactly, to help you make sense of it all.
Yeah.
And maybe, spark some of your own thinking along the way.
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a minute and try to put all of this information together. If you had to sum up the core message of these presidential actions, what would it be?
That's a good question. If you kind of peel back all the layers of rhetoric and all the policy details,
Yeah.
I think the main message is this. The government is trying to reassert its authority
Okay.
and redefine its role in society.
Oh.
They're pushing back against what they see as too much government involvement in the economy and people's lives,
Okay.
and they want to bring back more traditional ways of doing things,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to work and the workplace.
So it's like they're saying, let's get back to basics, shrink the government, empower individuals, and let the free market do its thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of nostalgia there,
Yeah.
like a longing for a simpler time. Before the pandemic, before social media, before the government got so involved in every little detail of our lives.
But is that even possible, though? Can we just turn back the clock and pretend the past few years didn't happen?
That's a really good question. I mean, the world has changed so much.
It has.
It's unlikely we can just go back to the way things were.
Right.
But I do think they have a point about finding a better balance,
Okay.
a more sustainable way to deal with all the complexities of the 21st century.
So maybe it's not about going backwards, but about finding a new path forward.
Exactly.
One that learns from the past, but also embraces the future.
Exactly. It's about being intentional, about the role of government, the balance of power, and the kind of society we want to live in,
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing that there's no single solution that's going to work for everyone.
Right. It's about finding solutions that work for all of us.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that we all need to be a part of.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to be a critical thinker,
Okay.
to question everything you hear, to dig deeper than just the headlines, and to form your own opinions.
Right.
Don't let anyone tell you what to think.
Yeah.
Do your own research, listen to different perspectives, and be willing to have respectful conversations with people who see things differently.
That's great advice. It's so easy to get caught up in echo chambers,
It
on
is.
social media or in the 24-hour news cycle. But it's so important to take a step back and think for ourselves.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo,
Yeah.
ask tough questions, and demand better from our leaders.
Well said. It's been an amazing journey exploring all of these presidential actions with you. Thanks for sharing your expertise and helping us navigate this crazy landscape.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Remember, stay curious, keep learning, and always be willing to dive deeper. We'll see you next time.